We live in some really strange times, don't we? And they're strange in any number of ways. For one thing, we live in a world ravaged by the whole ongoing COVID situation. For another, our society has managed to splinter itself into an ever-increasing number of insular identity affiliations defined by, well, pretty much anything you can think of. Race, gender, sexuality, religion, political inclination, you name it. However, in this video, I'd like to focus on what I feel is another strange element of life as we know it, and it has to do with two interrelated phenomena. First, a lot of the time it seems like we end up either idolizing or demonizing public figures, mostly according to the ideological positions they seem to represent. And at the same time, it seems like we frequently struggle with viewing them as the human beings they actually are. Of course, the most obvious example of all of that would probably have to do with our politicians, and more specifically with our national level politicians. You know, the Joe Bidens and Donald Trumps of the world. But I'd say that similar dynamics also play out with lower order political figures and even with celebrities, you know, actors, athletes, musicians, comedians, etc. But no matter where it occurs, I'd say that what's usually missing from the equation is seeing public figures as actual human beings, rather than as ridiculous, cartoonish caricatures. In other words, for the most part, what's missing is actual contact with reality. And so I thought it might be worthwhile to explore that phenomenon for 25 minutes or so, perhaps with an eye toward fostering a more realistic way of evaluating public personages, which in turn might even help to heal some of the divisive pathology afflicting our world these days. However, right from the start, it seems like we're faced with an impasse, and it has to do with how hard it can be to distinguish people's fabricated public personas from the actual human beings behind them. That's hardly ever an easy task, especially since the masks that they often wear are usually very thick, very sophisticated, and very well rehearsed. However, it seems to me that our principal challenge these days isn't really at that relatively detailed level of characterological analysis. Instead, it has more to do with something much more basic, namely, with viewing public figures in terms of the very general truths that run through virtually every human being's existence. For instance, I'd say it's generally true that we human beings are composites of both personal strengths and personal weaknesses. In other words, we're pretty much all bearers of both illumination and darkness, both intelligence and stupidity, as well as both order and chaos. And sure, some of us embody some of those attributes more than others, and they certainly play out somewhat differently for different people. But the one enduring constant seems to be that we're all composites, all amalgams of what's desirable and what's undesirable, what's beautiful and what's ugly. And contrary to a lot of today's popular mythology, the same is true of public personages too. In one way or another, all of our idols ultimately have feet of clay. And at the same time, all of our villains can't help but possess a few positive qualities, at least on occasion. And so the only real question that remains is whether we can be realistic enough to perceive them that way. Basically, to perceive them in terms of their actual humanity. But then the question becomes, okay, but what makes doing that so difficult? Why is it so much harder to view public figures as complex, multifaceted human beings rather than as simplistic, cartoonish caricatures? What makes it so hard to perceive other human beings as human beings, especially when they're in the public limelight? Well, I'd say that a big part of the difficulty lies in the fact that, somewhat contrary to popular opinion, we human beings hardly ever understand each other. Instead, what we're usually doing is judging each other and then mistaking our judgments for actual understanding. However, understanding other people involves making an appreciable effort to see the world as they themselves do, to glimpse how things make sense from their perspectives, even if they don't from our own. In contrast, simply judging other people requires none of that additional overhead. So we could say that judgment is a lot more common in our world, first because it's a lot easier and a lot less work. And we human beings tend to resist things that require actual effort. So I'd say that the first reason why we tend not to see public figures in terms of their fuller humanity is that doing so actually takes some work. And so it ends up being a lot easier and a lot faster just to judge them without actually trying to understand them. But beyond that, understanding other people also requires a measure of humility, which isn't necessarily a common virtue in today's narcissistic and entitled world. For instance, it takes a fair degree of humility to acknowledge the fact that how other people view the world is sometimes more valid than our own way of seeing it. Basically, the fact that sometimes other people are right and we're the ones who are wrong. And that's a challenge because it usually doesn't feel too good to have to admit something like that, most especially to ourselves. In fact, it usually feels like a stinging rebuke to our egos. And when it's looking like we might have to go through something like that, it suddenly becomes very easy to dismiss other people as being completely deluded idiots who just don't get it, which I think is a pretty common phenomenon in our world these days. But the problem with that strategy is that while it may protect our fragile egos, it also makes it extremely hard to perceive the reality of other people's basic humanity, especially when they have opinions that differ from our own, which in turn only exacerbates our world's divisions and animosities. So the second difficulty with seeing public figures as human beings lies in how doing so involves a degree of humility that tends to make our egos feel somewhat threatened. And that leads us to the third reason, which has to do with our addiction to self-importance. As I suggested in my last video, self-importance is probably the single most powerful drug in our world these days. So much so that it pretty much makes black tar heroin look like chamomile tea. But why? Why is self-importance so utterly seductive for so many of us? Well, for one thing, when we're filled with self-importance, it's very easy to experience the warm, almost erotic bliss of feeling like we're superior to other people. And more specifically, superior to the people we'd like to think of as our adversaries and enemies. So in a way, our addiction to it is perfectly understandable. Sure, it may be a somewhat crude and childish pleasure, and it's definitely not the most noble and elevated part of our souls, but it's there nonetheless. And so it's perfectly understandable as part and parcel of the human condition. After all, who among us doesn't enjoy feeling a giddy sense of superiority to the people around us? But once again, the problem is that that feeling doesn't do much to help us recognize their fuller humanity. Basically, it just creates distance rather than connection. So the third reason why it's so hard to see public figures as human beings lies in our habitual addiction to our own self-importance, together with our desires to feel superior to other people, which then gets in the way of cultivating humility, which in turn makes it very easy to go around judging other people and very difficult to understand them. But I'd say a fourth reason has to do with the effects of confirmation bias, which is a phenomenon that has to do with how easy it is to perceive things when they agree with how we want to see them, and to ignore them when they don't. Basically, confirmation bias means that we're probably going to find exactly what we're looking for in public figures. And that, in turn, makes it very easy to condemn them without acknowledging or even noticing the more positive sides of their humanity. So, if we're eager to see Joe Biden as a doddering, gibbering imbecile, we'll very easily find good reasons why that seems to be true. On the other hand, if we're eager to see Donald Trump as an arrogant, egomaniacal blowhard, we'll easily find convincing justifications for that perception too. And our confirmation biases will make it all seem very real and very convincing. But it will still be, at best, only a very partial, fractional picture of things, and hence a fundamental distortion of the larger reality at hand. So the fourth reason why it's so hard to view public figures in terms of their actual humanity is that our confirmation biases tend to skew our perception of them. Anyhow, since I'm starting to talk more specifically about political figures here in the United States, let's take a few minutes to explore some of the demonizing rhetoric people use to belittle and condemn them. We'll start with Joe Biden and then move to Donald Trump, just to keep things at least minimally balanced. Anyhow, if I had to name the kind of demonizing rhetoric people commonly use to denigrate Joe Biden, it would probably circulate mostly around the theme of stupidity. Like I said a minute ago, seeing him as a doddering, gibbering imbecile, usually with an admixture of senility. But then the unsettling question becomes, okay, but does that make Joe Biden fundamentally different from most other human beings on planet Earth? In fact, when you think about it, isn't it true that we're pretty much all bearers of stupidity to one degree or another? I don't know. Personally, I'd say that I have yet to encounter even a single non-stupid person in my 61 years of human existence. And yes, that would include myself too, because often enough, I too am a thoroughly incorrigible fool and nincompoop, just like virtually everyone else in the world. And in that regard, the only real difference between us seems to lie in how and when and how often our fundamental human stupidity announces itself. Oh, and by the way, little side note, we professors are imbeciles too. The fact is that we say and do and think plenty of dumb things, especially when we're outside of our academic comfort zones. So when you stop and think about it, calling each other stupid is really just a way of acknowledging an inherent part of our shared humanity. Sure, it's usually a pretty effective generic insult, but at the end of the day, we're hurt by it only insofar as we feel some degree of insecurity about our intelligence, which, yeah, is admittedly a fairly common thing. But on the other hand, when we become smart enough to recognize our own inherent stupidity along with everyone else's, which of course is a kind of paradox, well, it turns out that being called dumb isn't such an effective insult after all, especially since it boils down to a fairly obvious and ubiquitous part of the larger human equation. Basically, it's a little like trying to insult someone by calling him a mammalian biped, or by saying that he drops a stinky deuce in the toilet every day. Ooh, I am so freaking triggered. You called me out on my stinky deuces. And so calling Joe Biden stupid doesn't really say much about him. Sure, I'd agree that he doesn't seem like the sharpest knife in the drawer, but then again, politicians hardly ever do. Usually, they do seem to be somewhat smarter than average, but they're almost never stone cold brilliant, at least not in my estimation. Basically, they're a lot like virtually everyone else in the human race, walking bricolages of both intelligence and stupidity. But the main point I'm trying to make is that demonizing Joe Biden by calling him stupid just generates a distorted, cartoonish caricature of him that's completely at odds with the larger reality of his humanity. And ultimately, it just sows the seeds of more needless division and rancor in our world. Well, okay, but what about Donald Trump, I hear you asking? Well, I suppose that the most common demonizing rhetoric people use to belittle him would be something like, well, he's just an arrogant, racist, sexist wannabe dictator, isn't he? But here again, we might well ask, who among us doesn't have an arrogant little dictator running around somewhere inside of us? Personally, I haven't met that person yet either. And yeah, like stupidity, that particular part of us isn't necessarily mature or noble or beautiful. In fact, it's usually pretty infantile and unpleasant. But it's almost always there whether we like it or not. And yes, it's obviously true that some of us have inner dictators that are more overinflated than other people's are. And they express themselves somewhat differently from person to person, too. But the disturbing point is that pretty much every one of us has an inner Donald Trump lurking somewhere inside. Well, okay, maybe not Jesus, or maybe not Buddha, maybe not people lying in vegetative comas either, but pretty much everyone else in the world does. And when you think about it, aren't a lot of the rationalizations we use to justify our hatred of Donald Trump, along with our rabid desires to see him as fundamentally different from ourselves, probably little more than expressions of our discomfort with our own inner dictators, with the parts of ourselves that are a little bit too much like him? And yeah, we may try hard to repress and deny all of that, perhaps with some degree of success even, but if we're honest about it, which isn't necessarily an easy thing, at some childish and unreasonable level, who among us wouldn't enjoy having the chance to behave like arrogant, hyper-rich, ultra-pampered wannabe dictators, perched like haughty gargoyles on the high throne of our solid gold commodes, while we survey all of the woe and travail of the little people scurrying like insignificant insects far below us? You see, it's just the same basic set of dynamics that occur in the case of Joe Biden's supposed stupidity, just playing out in terms of a somewhat different sort of demonizing rhetoric. In both cases, it's about failing to recognize and acknowledge that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump aren't really so different from ourselves, not in terms of their basic humanity. And so it's really a mistake to view them as inhuman, cartoonish caricatures rather than as actual human beings, because in reality, they're just people. People whom fate has seen fit to cast in unlikely and very conspicuous public roles, but who inevitably possess both positive characteristics and negative ones, just like we ourselves do. And as I keep saying, refusing to see them that way does a lot to generate a world of fracture and division. You know, like the world you can see on virtually any random news broadcast these days. But I guess I'd like to move toward ending this video, as I so often do, with a few prescriptive suggestions about how we might respond to all of that, especially at the level of our everyday personal lives. And in that regard, I'd say that our first task would be to give up the unwholesome habit of seeing public figures purely in terms of demonizing rhetoric, and learning to see them, and everyone else on the planet for that matter, as the human beings they actually are. And that would mean being willing to recognize both their virtues and their faults, both their beauty and their ugliness. In other words, it would involve learning to be faithful to how things actually are, rather than how we want them to be. So my first suggestion would be to drop the incessant demonizing rhetoric and the distortions of reality that go along with it. And by the way, learning to do that would also have the side benefit of making us all a lot less manipulable and controllable by the news media, which in my view has now reached truly ludicrous levels. So there's that. Anyhow, my second suggestion would be related to the first one, but it may be a little tougher. And it would involve letting go of a lot of our overweening self-importance and learning to relate to life with a little bit more humility than usual. In my view, that's more or less essential, mostly because our self-importance is a pretty big part of what makes all the demonizing rhetoric so seductive in the first place, especially insofar as it ends up feeding the Moloch of our desire to feel superior to our fellow travelers in this life. But when you think about it, all of those sorts of desires don't really do us any credit. In fact, the vicious paradox of it is that the more desperately we strive for some sort of superficial superiority over others, the more clearly we demonstrate our own neurotic deformity. Oops. Oh, and speaking of humility, here's a pro tip. Beware of the paradoxical self-defeating trap of feeling superior to other people because we're more humble than they are. Anyhow, my third and final suggestion would take the form of a little thought experiment you might try, and it goes something like this. Try imagining the person in this world you hate the most. It could be a public figure like Joe Biden or Donald Trump, or it could be a historical figure, maybe one of history's mass murderers. Hell, maybe Heliogabalus from ancient Roman antiquity. Or it could be someone in the more everyday sphere, or even just a general type of person you despise. And as you're imagining that person, see if you can let yourself start to see how the world might appear from their perspective, how it might make a kind of sense to them, even if it doesn't to you. And as you're doing that, see if you can maybe start to feel a little compassion for the person you usually hate, and start to perceive that person in terms of his or her larger humanity, even if part of it repels you. At that point, start to imagine a different person, the kind of person you revere or idolize the most. Once again, it could be a public personage or a historical figure or someone in the everyday world. And see if you can let yourself begin to perceive some of that person's faults and foibles. You know, how he or she probably isn't really some sort of demigod or a fully evolved bodhisattva, but an actual human being, a bearer of both illumination and darkness, both beauty and ugliness. And if you're able to do both of those little exercises, well, I'd say, hey, that's hella bitchin'. Because it means that you've somehow managed to tear yourself away from at least part of the ridiculous consensual hallucination that our world is populated by good people who agree with us and bad people who don't. In other words, it means that you're probably a lot less caught up in fantasy and a lot closer to reality. In fact, probably closer than our world would even want you to be, which I personally think is a good thing, especially since it also means that you're probably more of a free thinker than you'd otherwise be. And at that point, I would say that the next task is probably the most difficult one. And it would be to embody all of that so deeply that the people in your life can start to sense it in you, especially so that they can perceive your presence as a living invitation to become a little bit more free themselves. Maybe it's not so much in what you say or in the values you espouse, but in the quality of your actual presence as you move from moment to moment, in how you breathe and sweat, or maybe in the look that sometimes appears in your eyes, as if you were witnessing something infinitely miraculous and beautiful in simply being alive. In my view, all of that's important because if we want to offer the world something other than a tacit affirmation of its prevailing pathologies, if we really want to help the universe give birth to something beyond itself, well, it has to start somewhere. So why not with us? Just a thought. Anyhow, I guess that's my sermon for today, complete with a couple of biblical Easter eggs for you. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching and listening, and of course, as always, take care of your soul.